book, A Place for You, Reframing Christian Womanhood, you discuss redefining traditional views of women's roles in the church. So what inspired you to write this book, and what core message do you hope that readers will take away from it?
I wanted to write this book because I came into the church as a woman who didn't really fit into the categories, some sweet, sweet friends who were early mentors and who loved me dearly, but they did really feel like to be a godly woman was to be a wife and a mom. I already have a daughter, kind of
what if I'm not the whole picture?
How's this going to work? They're like, I guess we have to pray for a husband, which, he came along pretty fast. So the Lord answered the prayer. No, I have always been somebody who loves learning, loves to read, loves deep thought, loves arguing with people. And so I kind of struggled with what's the place for a woman like me in this church? And as I would start to press and ask questions, what I really found in that church was kind of this belief that if they got the men, they would get the women. If men are called to lead, then that means if they're getting the men, that necessarily the women will come too. And what I was observing is you're trying to get the men and you're losing the women,
Interesting.
And so I would, start to press and challenge. And I went to the Gospel Coalition's very first women's conference, which is, I think, maybe 2012. And just a brand new believer. And I'm weeping as I'm hearing women teach the scriptures. And I'm standing in just this huge environment full of women that love God with their heart, souls, and minds. And I was so inspired by that and wanted to bottle that up and bring it back to my church. And I, met a little resistance along the way. And so over time, the Lord was just so sweet to cultivate this relationship of learning and partnership with my pastors. And I was able to help develop women's ministry in that church over time. But I think that experience is something that a lot of people have, this feeling, a lot of women, that it's where do I fit?
Totally.
What's my place? I'm of the persuasion, I hold to complementarian position, which means that I believe the scriptures teach that the Bible reserves the office of pastor and elder for qualified men, and that God calls husbands to lead their families in a distinct way. And within that complementarian space, there can especially be some challenges of okay, so where do the women fit?
Yeah.
And what about a woman like me who feels called to ministry and wants to be engaged in the life of the church? If I can't be a pastor, what's my path? A lot of women think about these as issues of injustice. It's this feels unfair. And the reason I wrote this book is I'm adopting lessons I learned from Kathy Keller, has a little pamphlet book. And she talks about this is not a justice issue, it's a theological issue.
Interesting.
And so I just want us to be women who we know God and we know our own minds. I don't want to either be women who only believe something because we've just that's just what we've always thought. That's what we've always been told.
Right.
And at the same time, I don't want us to be women who are persuaded by arguments because they feel more fair or they feel more just,
based on what society is telling us is fair.
Yes.
Right.
There are these societal values that have sort of crept into the church, and we're tempted to believe what they say because it makes us feel good rather than really wrestling with the text of scripture. And so that's my hope in this book, is to invite women to believe there is a good and spacious place for them in God's family, but also that they need to be persuaded by the scriptures about what that place is and not just how it feels,
That's such a beautiful sentiment. I think that just personally what I'm going through right now in my church home, which is kind of a struggle with that power dynamic, actually, I think that it's very encouraging to hear that. I'm just personally looking forward to reading through that book because of what I'm going through right now in my life. Can you tell people when it will be available and how they can purchase it?
Yes. The book comes out September 2nd. And so you can pre-order it right now. It's available on Amazon. It's published by Moody, so you can find it on their website as well. And
fantastic.
It's wild.
I'll link it in the show notes in case anyone wants a quick link to get to it. But I'm excited for it. So I hope that anybody else who's interested goes out and gets it, because it's going to be a great book. So we kind of talked about this a little earlier. Your book kind of started as letters to your daughter. You have several children. Balancing motherhood and a demanding career and authorship is really truly no small task. So how do you manage your responsibilities, and in what ways does your faith guide you through just life of doing all these things?
I just think it's so important to be honest about our limitations. And
Okay.
so that's where I would say, like, when you ask how my faith has shaped how I handle this juggling act, it's like, on the one hand, I'm someone who really feels deeply called to ministry. And so, like, my work is so shaped by my faith. And I know that's not true for everyone. You know, my husband's an engineer, and his faith still shapes his work in that he wants to work with integrity, and he wants to serve his neighbor through the work of engineering. And those things are true for me too, but also, like, my faith is so integrated into the work that I'm doing, into the content I'm creating, and the people I'm ministering to, and things like that. But also in humbling me as a creature before God, who says, I can't do and be everything. So like, I have to depend on the Lord for wisdom, which he promises to give generously to anybody who asks.
Yeah.
And I have to have the humility to say, like, I can't do that, which I'm just really bad at, but I'm asking him to grow me in that.
Well, that's great advice for any mom, or someone who's just like maybe a single mom or a working mom, or someone who wants to do that someday and be a mom. It's like, oh gosh, how am I going to juggle it all? I think that it's encouraging to
You're
hear
not.
that.
Just ask for help. That's my biggest thing. Just ask for help. We need it. We all need help.
Yeah. One of my friends that I talked to in a previous episode, who was a new mom, she said that the biggest thing that she learned was that she needed help, and that there was a community that God provided for her for a reason. And she didn't have to be like stubborn and just be like, I can do this by myself. You don't have to. You literally don't have to.
Right.
So she learned to say yes, which I think was a really good thing that she learned. Well, this is an interesting question here. According to a Barna research study, there has been a significant decline in church attendance among women, kind of like you were talking about earlier, with weekly attendance dropping from 48% in 2009 to 31% in less than a decade. As someone who advocates for women's active participation in the church, what factors do you believe contribute to this trend, and how can the church address it? I'm sure that, I mean, if that study was done years ago, I'm sure that that number has even changed past COVID. So what is something that you can see as maybe a cause for that, and how can the church address that?
Yeah, it's hard to speak, authoritatively about what the cause is, but we are seeing this trend, even that for the first time in history, more men are coming into the church as women are leaving the church, which is just throughout history has not been the case. Christianity has been predominantly female from its inception because of the way that it's so good for women, that where the gospel goes, women's rights and their view as, their value increased among the community. Okay. And so, it's such a shame to see those numbers. And I suspect there are a couple of things. Like, on the one hand, I do think we have to face the reality that, like, we're coming out of this stretch of, there's been scandals and abuse all throughout history, right? Yeah. But like more and more exposure, more and more conversations about them. I think people are just weary. Like, I think there's a lot of women, and I think men out there, who are like longing for a reckoning. Like, they want to see abuse of power held accountable. They want to see, women not being second-class citizens in the church. They want their value to be affirmed. And I think there is something happening there that we need to think about like, how are we communicating the value and contribution of women in the church. But there's this great book, The Great Dechurching, that kind of digs into the reasons that people are dechurching. And one of the fascinating things that they found is that it's actually because people are busy. Like, it's like people stop going to church because maybe they move to a new town and they just like never find a new church. Maybe their kids start having sports games on Sunday mornings, or maybe like Sunday mornings, it's like when your gym friends all do yoga together, or maybe,
or church is online and it's easier to just stay home.
It's easier to stay home. And I kind of think that those numbers, when you think about it, like, women are often they are the instigators for going to church. And so,
well, that was the interesting point that you brought up earlier. And I remember when we went through this book at Sola, was that I think it was like, the women are going to be the ones to convince their husbands to come to church.
Yes. And that was the case in the early church. It was so crazy. All these wealthy women were converting to Christianity in the ancient world. And they were influential then towards their husbands to protect Christians, to advocate for the church, even to see these people converted. And so that's, been true throughout the history of the church. And I just wonder if women are, getting pulled into I don't want to call them worldly cares. Like these are things that matter. So there might be worldly values that have assaulted women and convinced them and led them astray. But I also just think that we have to be honest that like sometimes it's not even injustice. It's just busyness. And it's like getting caught up in like, it feels like too much work to go to church. And I don't know. I think that's got to be a big factor.
And how do you see churches coming alongside the people who are busy or maybe would rather stay home or reaching out to people who are new to the area? What is some ways that maybe you've seen your own church do work to that?
Well, in my book, I talk about like wanting to call women to conviction and courage. And I think that's one thing here is like, I don't think that we have helped people form a good conviction for the church.
Okay.
That the church is not just like this thing that's okay to do sometimes. It's not a club you're a part of. It's not like this low tier, low level on your priority list. Like the church is both law and gospel. So like we are told in scriptures not to forsake meeting together, that this is, God's call. He calls us to worship him every Sunday. And that's an expectation as a disciple that you come to worship.